The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body.
And so what we're trying to do is find, per individual, the sweet spot on how to balance the volume of workload, the amount of rest and recovery, and any other factors that we can control. And that balance is aimed at maximizing the potential and performance, which essentially means staying as active as possible and away from injuries and burnout or whatever that is. So that's what our machine learning is trying to do. It's not about predicting the injury as a magical box. It's about forecasting risk and creating a set of intervention strategies that can, over time, reduce the incident rate, keeping people at their peak for longer.
You've just been listening to today's guest, who I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast, Mr. Tal Brown. So Tal is the CEO and co-founder of Zone 7, who are a company using data-driven artificial intelligence to assist in the optimization of human performance, particularly in the elite athlete and athletic space. But increasingly, they have moved into the performance and well-being space in other disciplines, including healthcare. And that is where my interest and the focus of our particular conversation lies today. Tal has a background in computer science and systems and began his career as a big data engineer in the Israeli Defense Forces Intelligence Corps. He subsequently went on to become a senior director for Salesforce. Now at Zone 7, he develops and applies proprietary artificial intelligence to help athletes, coaches and medical teams forecast injury risk and attain peak performance. And he has worked with a number of professional and amateur teams now worldwide. We spoke about the work that he does do within the sporting realm, but then increasingly how this has become applied to other disciplines, including healthcare and the military. So I really enjoyed talking tech with Tal. I think it's fair to say that in many other areas of technology and computer science, I would definitely be considered a laggard. I do think maybe I'm amongst the early adopters, being enthusiastic about this application of technology. I'm currently reading The Emergency Mind by Dr. Dan Dworkis, which I've mentioned before on the podcast. It's recently been released and I'll put another link in the show notes. And I'm looking forward to getting Dan on the podcast, hopefully later next month, to talk more about the book. But as I'm going through it, there's a number of things that stand out that are relevant to our conversation today in Dan's work. So he does talk about using algorithmic and creative thinking. And, we talk a bit about algorithms today, but also then the nuance of applying that in individual settings. And, he also, one of the kind of passages Dan talks about us being humans, not robots. But it does strike me that we are still very robotic in the way that we operate and in the environments and cultures that we work in. And the irony to me seems to be that we might actually have to get very objective and algorithmic to revisit the humanity and the necessity of our vital bodily functions that we quite often can ignore during critical times in high pressure environments. So the hunger, anger, lateness, the tiredness. So, without further ado, I invite you to bring an open mind and enjoy this conversation where we talk about the application of this technology in human performance, in not only in sport but in the healthcare environment. Enjoy. Thanks again, Tal, for making time for this conversation. I know we briefly connected a few weeks ago, and I'm really looking forward. I know this audience will be particularly receptive. So, by way of introduction, I would love if you could tell us a bit about your professional background as a computer scientist, big data engineer, and how in your journey this has led you to where you find yourself today as the co-founder of Zone 7.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to be on the podcast. Thank you, Cheryl, for having me. It's not often that I get to share about my journey with this kind of audience, so an absolute pleasure. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I from an early age I had an affinity to computers, although I wouldn't call myself a fantastic programmer. And when I was fortunate to be able to go to university straight after school and got a degree in computer science from the University of Warwick, which just then actually opened its medical school. And there was for a few weeks there, I thought I should be doing that. But so graduated as a computer scientist, and then because of my Israeli background, I was returning to Israel to do my military service, which is mandatory in Israel. And so I spent 3 years writing software for the intelligence corps, working on what today we can call big data problems, and got a bug. I mean, I liked it. I enjoyed it. It was exciting. It also had a sense of solving very, very big problems with very lean teams. And so the 10 years that followed, spent my career in tech. But I also realized that I am a computer scientist by training, but I am more drawn to what we call outbound business roles. I like to talk to clients and help them solve problems. So I spent a few years of doing that, and then kind of stars aligned. I got a little bit lucky. I was hired as probably the first product manager at a big company called Salesforce that was tasked with creating machine learning technology for the company. And so spent 5 years doing that. So product management is this interesting intersection of different disciplines in tech. And so at the end of that tenure, I was, a little bit older and experienced, but also had a keen interest to apply these skill sets to a different domain where I actually, felt connected to emotionally. And that's how I became to found Zone 7.
Fantastic. So I like that emphasis on big problems, lean teams, because I think in my professional space, a lot of that resonates. As I was kind of doing a bit of background research for this, I realized I didn't really know. Artificial intelligence is a bit of a buzzword, and I thought I actually don't really know what that means. And you have some great articles on the Zone 7 website, and you talk about this being algorithms that learn from data, and you go into the kind of scientific rigor behind it, and a lot of that is akin to many of the clinical research trials, and that's the analogy that we use in medical practice. But we're quite well aware on this podcast there's science, there's art, and there's practical application. And I'd love for I task you to kind of break it down and speak a bit about artificial intelligence as applied to elite athletes and human performance, and how you're doing that in the Zone 7 space with individuals and teams.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, I'll start by saying that anything I say that has any sports medicine or context should be interpreted with the knowledge that I'm not a medically trained professional. I spent my career in tech, machine learning, so the audience is probably going to know a lot more about the physiology and the medicine a lot more than myself. But if you zoom out for a little bit, so let's talk about what artificial intelligence means. I actually like using the term machine learning a little bit more than artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has this context to it of like the autopilot that will replace pilots and the chess program that will replace human chess players. What machine learning to me is about is carving out a very specific problem that you would like to solve, gathering a very large data set that describes different occurrences of that problem in different scenarios, different environments, different outcomes. Sometimes you solve it, sometimes you don't. And you use all that data to first of all, you clean all the data in a very, very big library, and then you ask a very specific type of algorithm to analyze that data in retrospect and to try and find patterns that precede either the positive outcomes or the negative outcomes. And then you apply those patterns in real time to a stream of live new scenarios. And your success in doing that is not going. There is no success or failure. There is a spectrum of results. You could be extremely accurate or not at all accurate, but there is a gray area in there. There is and your success commercially or medically or whatever depends on how well you communicate your level of confidence and level of maybe uncertainty to the individuals using this. So that's kind of like machine learning to me. Now, Zone 7 operates in a very unique area because our machine learning is not plugged seamlessly into the universe. We are not an algorithm that controls pricing on Amazon, or we're not an algorithm that will decide to buy or sell shares. Our results are used by human operators. So we are a GPS tool at the hands of the pilot, or, that's a good analogy. So the pilot needs to be aware of the tool's confidence and the tool's potential blind spots. So that's the world we operate in. And for Zone 7, we've tried to build a problem that we try to build a solution that addresses this problem. Human beings are pushed beyond their limits. It could be physically in a sport environment around lifting weights or sprinting. It could be in a work environment around, working too late, too often, not getting enough sleep. But there's physiological data describing the conditions. There is medical data describing the outcomes, right? An injury is a medically documented event. And so what we're trying to do is find per individual the sweet spot on how to balance the volume of workload, the amount of rest and recovery, and any other factors that we can control. And that balance is aimed at maximizing the potential and performance, which essentially means staying as active as possible and away from injuries and burnout or whatever that is. So that's what our machine learning is trying to do. It's not about predicting the injury as a magical box. It's about forecasting risk and creating a set of intervention strategies that can, over time, reduce the incident rate, keeping people at their peak for longer.
Is that, after a number of years of working in athletics and elite sport, there is now, particularly in specific disciplines like elite soccer, is now a large body of data that you can plug into algorithms. And, Zone 7 technology has a proven track record there. And I think anyone listening to this podcast for a period of time will kind of know my kind of take on the large body of the science and psychology of performance that comes largely from the sporting and athletic literature, that I feel that, much of it is translatable across disciplines. And I would really like to incorporate more of this into the training and treatment of doctors and healthcare professionals throughout their careers, not just in training. I do think we have improved considerably in recent years in some of the technical aspects of training, so drilling and simulation, deliberate practice. I think more attention to human factors is certainly being built in, and it's really encouraging. But I do feel that we fall short on periodization, on creating opportunities for maximal adaptation, for rest, recovery, sleep, hydration, nutrition, all of the other very important aspects of human performance. And this is an area where the data doesn't lie. We are facing a crisis in terms of our rates of burnout, our ability to maintain longevity of practice in our key, particularly emergency workforce. And so I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today because my understanding is that Zone 7 has started to extend into, my professional space. You're working or starting to work with early adopters in healthcare and the military. So I would love to hear more about the work of Zone 7 here and, what it looks like in practice.
Okay. So to talk about that, let me just quickly describe a little bit more details what we do in sports, because the athletic environment translates somewhat to other environments. So think about several data streams. One data stream would be measuring your what we call external workload. The volume of meters you're sprinted and weights lifted and all that. Then you've got internal workload, which is how your body responds to that. Then you've got data sets about your well-being, the watches and the rings collecting HRV and sleep and stress. And you've got a data set about your operational outcome, right? How fast did you run the marathon and how many goals did you score? And then there's a medical record curating, things like injuries or other incidents. So the machine learning that we've built can understand and decipher and interpret all that together. And more importantly, it can create a large data set across many different individuals, many different teams that this serves as a much bigger fuel tank to the machine learning than it would have been if it would just be one or two people or one or two teams. So what we do outside of sports is use the same guiding principles, which is data describing the individual's response to the let's say the conditions. So watches and rings and Garmin and Aura and sleep and stress and HRV and heart rate at rest. We try and capture some sort of quantification of the conditions themselves. How many hours have you worked? Was it day or was it night? During your work time, what did you do? Were you driving? Were you operating? Were you walking around? Were you lifting people off beds? And then we also look at operational data. What were the outcomes of your work? Could be good outcomes, could be unwanted outcomes, like bad decisions made. So the same principles in sport apply somewhat in the other environments. And what we've done in military is apply a very close to the athletic model. So physical workload, internal response, injuries. And in the medical workforce, we are using shift work schedule data to understand roughly what you are doing and when. And we use data from off-the-shelf wearables like watches and rings to measure your body's response. And we're correlating that with the outcome. The outcome can either be a medically curated event, right? Somebody had the flu or somebody reported burnout or even quit their job. These are documented binary events in your record. Or it could also be things like self-reported fatigue, exhaustion questionnaires. So we can kind of pick up breadcrumbs leading to that. So that's a little bit about how we do it, how we apply the technology outside of sports. The requirements are some sort of physiological data coming from a wearable, usually a wearable, some sort of the understanding of the work environment, the cadence of working, the cadence of rest, and some quantification of the outcome, which would be either, missing days from work or potentially a phenomenal day at work where all the decisions you've made were absolutely perfect. So that is the kind of data we pull in. As far as we've seen, very few companies make a point of dealing with data from different dimensions like this. Data from a watch is very, very, very different than work scheduling data. It's, very few, as far as we've seen, data scientists have actually tried to merge these into a singular model.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great overview. There's so many little thought bubbles just popping up outside my head right now. And I really want to dive into a few of the things that you've picked up on there in more detail. I'm really, intrigued around this, rostering. I think that and shift scheduling and plugging that into your algorithm is, I think it's so important. And But you know, I'm actually struggling with this. You know, I'm obviously probably the polar opposite of a computer scientist, and I think anyone who's followed my podcasting journey to date would, you know, probably have firmly classed me in the late adopters when it comes to technology, because I do struggle. And you know, look, I think we've taken the example of elite soccer, and I know that you have a prominent role there, and I can understand that, you know, there's a lot of data. There is a consistency there, and I can see how it would be more easily reproducible. I suppose when I then think about my own professional space and the heterogeneous nature of different disciplines, different departments, different rosters, different you know, even organizations within healthcare. So I'm struggling to see how it works in practice, and what would it actually mean? Would it mean that you would actually be, you know, how much data would you need, and would you need to be working, you know, with individual units, for example, or a particular group of professionals?
So it's a very, very, very good question. How much data can you pull together, and how many different variations of your algorithms do you need? So what we've learned from sport is that, first off, every sport is different. You cannot use rugby data with basketball players, or tennis data with cricket players. You just can't. So every sport is its own little fiefdom. But even within the sport, sometimes you have to split it up. So what we do in football, soccer, for example, is if you're over 17 and you're a pro, and in some cases semi-pro, but you know, you'd have to be training 4 or 5 times a week, we will put you in the same model. So, you know, the elite Premier League teams could go in the same model with a second division team in, you know, Italy. Doesn't mean they get to see each other's data. It just means that that model can be curated together. It's based on the type of data coming in, so the type of wearables and the similarity in the parameters, but it also has to do with the similarities in what professional athletes in soccer look like. You know, they train every day, they have a coach, the environment is controllable. When we go into gender, we definitely split it up. We don't use men's data with women's athletes and vice versa, because it doesn't make sense medically. We also have age cutoffs. We don't use 12-year-old data from 12-year-olds in an academy with pros. So those kinds of distinctions there is no playbook for them. There is no article in a sports science or a data science journal describing this. You have to figure it out as you go along. And for that, you need a team that knows how to do that, which I was blessed to have, because everybody in our team is people who have created and delivered machine learning tools in other industries for 20 years. So that's where machine learning is an expertise, with people who may have never played football or even trained medically, combines with people who understand the domain, which is, you know, sports doctors and coaches. So what I think is going to happen for us in the medical side with hospitals is that there will be cases where we have to create separate models, but my guess is it won't be so much about the location of the hospital. It will be more about the kind of job. You know, we may discover that, you know, nursing professionals need a different model than, you know, I don't know what, neurosurgeons. Emergency staff may have different issues facing them physiologically. So that stuff is, you know, being figured out. But ultimately, that's one of the cool things about this project, is that, you know, you have to make these decisions. And that's where the experience in doing this in other industries really pays off.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, you know, it's interesting what you say about gender specific data there, because, you know, unfortunately, a lot of I suppose the rules that we play by in my workspace, we actually have very limited scientific research data, particularly in females. You know, it includes in sports medicine. I'm thinking about a lot of the concussion data, although that is improving, is based on male players. And you know, and I think for many reasons, you know, females are thought to be too hard to study in scientific kind of clinical research, just too many variables. So, you know, we do see a big imbalance there. So, you know, it's interesting that you're light years ahead in that particular area.
Well, I mean, we may be acknowledging that theoretically a different model is what the way to go, but the challenging thing is that there's just less data. So what we're doing
Yeah.
right now,
Yeah.
specifically with women's football, is we are offering very, very generous pilot programs to women's teams, so we can, quickly or more quicker create that model for women. We've done this with already 4 teams
Fantastic.
in football, and it's a different model. Like, it's a different model. It has different attributes. There are things about the female physiology that are unique to these models. We have input parameters that describe some of the things about the female physiology, and that was for us phenomenal. And really, really exciting. We never thought you would get there this fast. But I do think that we need to advocate for a more fair distribution of resources and capital to
Yeah.
female athletes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you have said that, many of the inputs, the information, the data that you're gathering in healthcare will look a bit different from that in sports and athletics. So you will be, paying attention to shift work and rostering. It will have comparisons in that it's likely to be discipline specific. But I'm also curious about the other inputs that you are using in sports and athletics as measures of performance that might also translate. I'm conscious that it's not just a group of clinicians who are listening to this podcast. There are many athletes, and there's a big group of runners and cyclists. And, many of us, we've talked about wearables, but many of us do have some kind of GPS device, and which is constantly giving us information. The runners turn up and, compare who's got the latest model of Sunto or Coros or Garmin. But I'm also conscious these devices are ubiquitous in my workplace. I've got Apple and Fitbit, and, many people are wearing some form of wearable that is giving them information. And look, I suppose I have a mixed experience of using data in my athletic training and my running training. Maybe when I'm preparing for an event, I do pay a bit more attention. I certainly find, and I think many of us, the experience is that a lot of the recovery kind of estimation times from the watches tend to be very conservative, and I certainly take many of those with a pinch of salt. I do find a lot of the trends more useful, and I do look at heart rate variability, the surrogate for VO2 max, and I have an actigraph on my watch, so I will look at sleep data. I am conscious though, I don't really pay so much attention to it and it strikes me that I should when I'm doing shift work, when I have a particularly, intensive or stressful shift. I'm quite well aware, we've spoken frequently on this podcast that, the body doesn't actually differentiate physical stress from, physical exertion, to mental stress, to cognitive load, to, all of the other inputs that it still processes as stress. Yeah, and again, we've talked about the fact that, stress is necessary, and that we need, the physical, the mental stress to improve, to learn, to grow. But we have to, and you've said at the beginning, find the sweet spot and being able to balance that, maintaining the right degree of pressure so that we don't actually go into that frazzle, burnout, red zone. And, we know this. I do think, however, we struggle to, and largely in part due to the nature of the environments and the cultures that we work in, but to actually identify when we are hungry, angry, late, tired, sad, overwhelmed. And the great irony is that I actually wonder if by getting objective about this, we might actually be better able to acknowledge the subjective and the intuitive. So with all of that in mind, I'd be curious if I was to give everyone in my department a wearable tomorrow, what would it look like if you were starting to take some of this data and apply Zone 7 technology?
So the revolution of the self, whatever we call it, the self-quantified individual, the quantified athlete, or the quantified elite worker or high performer, it's a phenomenal revolution. I'm personally wearing a ring. When I run, I have a watch for that. This started, and this is my opinion as an outsider to the industry. This started by collecting data, right? I just run 5K, and I want to know exactly how many steps, or that's the cadence of the run, and how much elevation was done, and all that stuff is data now coming in. That's trivial. Now we're collecting data about what happens when I'm not training, the quality of my sleep, and my heart rate at rest, and my HRV, and et cetera, et cetera. What I find is that visualizing this data to individuals requires a lot of mental energy to digest the information. So when you look at your run, or when you look at your HRV waking up in the morning, you need to look at that number and contextualize it to you and figure out what it means. Are you in a good spot or a bad spot? And I always use the metaphor from my own doctor giving me that little piece of paper with the glucose levels, and then there's like a printed out left side and a printed out right side, and all you need to know is that you're in the middle, not too much left or too right. That process applied to 10 or 20 or 50 parameters is very hard to do. And it's not just, am I in the good zone or the red zone? It's also about, what should today's workout look like? Should I run 12K today, or 18, or 9, or none at all? Or should I exchange yoga for tennis today? Whatever. Those decisions are not done for you. You are almost forced to make them yourself. Let me take another extreme example. You can go on Peloton every day in the week for a year, or you can go running with Garmin every day for a year. And you may be doing things that are not great for your well-being.
Okay.
And there will be no red lights, or some of these products will flash, but not in the way we would expect from other scenarios, right? They won't flash like a medical sensor would flash if something very bad is happening. So when we look at that, that is what we aspire to create. And there's a long way to get there, is to create a trusted alarm bell that you can feel is reliable, but also to create intervention options for you. And by intervention, doesn't necessarily mean rest. You may be overtraining. The solution doesn't mean take a day off. The solution may mean to cut your distances by half today. Or you could be undertraining. The right thing for you to mitigate risk may be to actually do more squats, or adding workload. So that's what we aspire to do. In a medical environment, it's a little bit different. We would look at all the signals coming from the watch or the ring. And we would create a baseline for you. What does HR rest look like for Cheryl? What's a good night's sleep look like for Cheryl? And you do that only by looking at a big enough chunk of historical data. And the first thing we do with clients is say, if you don't have a couple of weeks of data in the system, we'll wait. We do not activate the alert system for you until we have that baseline. So we baseline you, and then we correlate your baseline with what you've been doing during that time. So, in sports, it's easy. We know if you've been running or swimming or cycling, but in work, we would need to pull in some kind of work schedule. So then we can create a baseline for, this is what Cheryl's HR at rest look like while doing a night shift on a Tuesday. And with enough examples of such night shifts, you can create a very rich profile, a very rich baseline. This is what happens 24 hours after a night shift, right? It's important how long you would need to bounce back to certain baseline values of positive well-being. So that's what we would do. And then this would be manifested in tactical intervention, which could be you're walking in a shift, but we would alert you, or maybe even your manager or administrator. Looks like this is going to be an iffy day there. We should look at ways to make it easier. It could be in real time. We're doing some work right now with industrial environments. This person has been exposed to a high heart rate for 15 minutes straight. We should give it a stop. Or it could also be strategic, which is basically around rescheduling work. Cheryl should not be doing more than 2 night shifts in a week. Or Cheryl's performance drops 20% when she does back-to-back night shifts. We should not do that. So that kind of insights around scheduling is also extremely powerful. So that's how the software interacts with the medical environment. It could be tactical interventions, morning time or real time. Could also be strategic around calibrating workload per individual, right?
Yeah, I find this absolutely fascinating. I know that you and I spoke a few weeks ago about the epidemic of exhaustion and fatigue and burnout facing many of our key workforce. And it is a particularly big problem in the healthcare profession. but many other disciplines are similarly affected, and to some extent. And I think the pandemic has served to heighten and unmask this. I read a very articulate blog post by Roger Mitchell on your website, and he talks about how he's using with Zone 7 data and deep learning to create preventative policies and actions surrounding the stress and fatigue of his key workforce. He goes on to say that whether organisations currently realise it or not, one of the very big trends for this decade in the workplace will be protecting the welfare of its staff. And, he goes on to say that this shouldn't be a box-ticking, regulation-following or virtue signalling exercise. It's a critical mission. I couldn't agree more. I am conscious that many of the challenges that we face in healthcare are at the level of the systems and the organisational cultures that we work in. And to improve things, we actually have to focus much of our attention there. Certainly, there's something happening at all the levels, but I think focusing solely on individuals is really missing the mark. You only have to throw or mention resilience training to a group of doctors or nurses and you'll get a group grown. We frequently talk about this canary in the coal mine analogy that the implication of many of these individually directed strategies is that the problem is with you. And so while I see the value in having individual data that we can utilise ourselves, I'm conscious that our problems are much greater than that. I kind of go on then to think about confidentiality of data. You mentioned the last time, individuals own their own data. So how do we preserve that autonomy, that confidentiality, but while using it in a meaningful way to create change in systems and organizations?
So I fully agree with everything you've said. We are today dealing with the very sensitive data of some of the highest earning individuals on the planet.
Yeah. This is true.
Yes. We know how much they lift in the weight room and how fast they run and a lot of stuff that I won't kind of go into detail, but we do that. And some companies, some of them right here in Silicon Valley have mistreated personal data and they have lost the trust of their consumers. But there are very well-defined lines that need to be understood about what a third party can do with your data. So the principles that we operate with are pretty much the similar principles to how medical data is being managed. So you own your data as a Zone 7 client forever. We have the temporary right to store it, process it for you, but we don't own it. Okay, so if you want to delete it, we will delete it. That is number one. There's no ownership of the data. You're not handing over ownership. And in most countries, I'm not a legal expert, I think it's actually illegal to you cannot hand over ownership of your medical data to somebody else. So that's the number one. I think individuals will always own their data, and if they're engaged with a system that doesn't allow that, that's a red flag. The second thing is, what can that company do with the data aside from processing it for me? Can that company sell it to somebody else? That's happening in certain industries, like your location data. Your phone will collect your location. Sometimes that information will find itself in places you didn't want it to be. But in our case, the only thing we ask to do with your data is to use it to further improve the algorithm internally. Nobody will oversee it. Even our employees don't have access to sometimes to sensitive. But by analyzing more examples of medical professionals working night shifts in an emergency environment, we can make the algorithm better for that environment. And that is what we ask for permission from clients, and that's what usually they opt in. So that's the principles we operate on. We have full transparency on what we do with your data, where we store it, how safely it is stored, the kind of analytics we apply on it, and whether we use it for anything else other than improving the product. So that is fully transparent to our clients. And I spent 5 years at Salesforce, which is a large, publicly traded Silicon Valley company, but it has a phenomenal record of trust. And that's kind of like where these principles kind of came to me. It's through understanding the sacred trust that companies and clients have providing their data for.
Yeah, and I think it's imperative that we start measuring and get very transparent about this. We are doing this in other parts of the world. The Mayo Clinic have been measuring data on workforce well-being, leadership, burnout for best part of 2 decades. And much of the input data is anonymous at individual level and then aggregated at unit and department level. I know that you are working with early adopters of Zone 7 technology, for example, in Columbia University, with trainees and in some of the hospitals in Israel. I would love to see your vision of how you can see this technology being rolled out across the healthcare space and looking at particularly at workforce well-being.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think that the for many years the way to address this would have been to do a study, right? You need to trade off the study sample size and the operational complexities, right? You can study 50 people, but not 5,000. So you try and pick a study population that represents the ultimate goal. You are limited in the volume of data you can capture. You end up using the more classical approach of statistical regression to try and find correlations and that. And so then you apply that to other environments. Every environment is going to be different than the environment you actually did the study on. Although, if you're carefully calibrating, you could actually not stray too far, but people do stray, right? Some of the experience I had with military is that a lot of the effort physiology frameworks were created from studies that were 20, 30 years ago on a population of people who looked differently, weighed differently, ate differently, did very different kinds of exercises. So what I'd like to happen, our vision is that by aggregating a lot of data, by aggregating data about thousands and even tens of thousands of individuals, let's say working in emergency environments, we will be the system will be able to create accurate warning before people are about to cross that threshold of well-being issues, for example, burnout. And it will also be calibrated per individual, because a 55-year-old, not so healthy, smoking, whatever, is going to have very different thresholds than a 26-year-old, lean, different gender, whatever. So
absolutely.
Today, we don't have the tools to tweak the formulas for that.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't have them. So we operate with kind of like basic formulas that are good, but could be much, much better. So I imagine the world going to that direction. We will be able to personalize, and we will be able to use that personalization for good, which is helping you know when you're about to break down and suggesting what can be done about it.
And
and what I can say about sports is that rest is not the right solution in most cases. Less workload is a solution. Sometimes more workload is. For us, it's about 2/3 of recommendations are about reducing workload, and 1/3 of the recommendations are about increasing workload as a mitigating factor, as a de-risking approach. But ultimately, there is no one equation to do that. You have to calibrate per individual and take into account everything you know about them.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many parallels with the way that we think and practice in medicine. There is, there's evidence-based practice and then there's environment-based practice. We've got to take any data in the context of the individuals that we're working with in their specific environment. Yeah, and, you would think that a lot of this is intuitive and makes common sense when it comes to dealing with a workforce and human behavior. But, I actually think we do need the objectivity, as I've said before.
I agree. I think the skepticism about this AI magical box coming over and fixing the skepticism is justified because, number one, I'm a trained engineer. A big part of training is to apply patterns to a problem. there is creativity, but many times you basically apply a pattern, and you learn to trust patterns, and you learn to mistrust new patterns. Maybe not, ferociously, but for a pattern to be a trusted pattern, you need to go through some kind of validation process. So that's number one. The other reason why we're mistrusting, as generally speaking, is because there is a lot of bullshit out there. There's a lot of snake oil, and there's a lot of science that has muddied the water for better science that will come after it. And people in the medical profession, and that's a huge generalization, but a lot of the folks I meet who have medical roles, they have very, very, very tall fences or tall moats to protect them from all the bullshit that is thrown at them. And they do that. If they wouldn't have done that, they couldn't have done their job. So it's actually a good thing to have a very sensitive bullshit radar.
Yeah, but I think as a counter to that, I think we can often be quite rigid in the way we think too. I can think of examples when we are faced with some fairly good quality evidence to suggest that something that we've been doing for a long time in our practice routinely isn't useful or helpful. I can think of a few examples of this, but I recently presented a paper at our journal club that, basically did just this. And, it's really interesting to kind of see the kind of cognitive reframing and people are really struggling with, well, what will I do tomorrow on the shop floor? I've always done it this way. What do you mean this doesn't work? I think it does. And, I think that mental flexibility can be really challenging.
And how much evidence would you need to change a pattern that you trust? Would it, so in the case of Zone 7, right? How many case studies of teams in football would you need to see in order to accept, or in order to look at this pattern with fresh eyes? Is one team having less injuries enough? Is it 5 teams? Is it 100 teams? So that is also a subjective issue. We each have a different calibration on the moat that the new science or the new approach will need to address. So that's part of the challenges of my role. It's not just about creating technology, Silicon Valley style, that is cool and fast and all that. It's also about, I want to say winning the hearts and minds, but it's also about, creating science-driven proof that this has merit. And so a big part of that is not overstepping your boundaries and not stepping on landmines and holding back if you're not 100% confident in the results you're showing. And that's what we do. That's what we do.
Yeah, I find this topic and your work very exciting, Tal. And, I do envisage that in some part this will become integral across many disciplines in the future with respect to workforce support, planning, wellbeing, performance. I'm aware that I'm probably an early adopter in looking at how we might use this in healthcare. And I do fully expect that there'll be a chasm that ensues in terms of how this might, in the future be adopted in my work environment. But look, if there is anybody listening who would like to learn more about you and your work, and maybe employing this in their healthcare organization specifically, how should they go about contacting you?
So we have got, I'm a pretty visible guy on LinkedIn. Our website is great. There's a contact form thing there. I would say the interesting thing about engaging Zone 7 is that it is about the trust building process with the client. It is about it's our job, it's our burden to quote unquote convince you that what we do is real. And so the entire process of engaging clients is built around that premise. It's not about here's the product, you should buy it. It's about what kind of data have you got? What are you trying to solve for? Give us a chance to create a model and show you results, and then let's scrutinize that together. So it's a very different kind of engagement from a tech perspective. And then once we do that a few times in a new environment, then it becomes, I would say what we call scalable or scaling in, here in the startup world, which is, you figured out a certain playbook and you can go and replicate that. So we're doing that right now in soccer and in rugby, and we're doing new sports are joining that every month. But we're also very conscious that some environments will be new, right? We won't, so we're very transparent about that.
Yeah, I'm also conscious that we haven't spoken about cost and financial investment. Elite sport is one domain, healthcare quite another in that respect. But I'm also conscious that the more available and utilised a new technology is, the more accessible it becomes. And I really like what you have mentioned about making it more equitable and available to female athletes, for example. Just before we go on to the kind of wrap-up questions, is there anything else that you think is big ticket that we haven't covered off today, particularly with respect to this audience and the healthcare environment and the work that you do?
No, I think what you said originally was very, very, very powerful. There are professions that are being asked to go beyond the call of duty physically, emotionally, mentally, kind of like athletes. And I definitely think that, the medical professionals are in that group. So I would personally, I have a ton of respect for that and would love to see, whether we can be helpful in those environments. And this is also partly about what the company's about. It's not just about supporting the very rich and very powerful and very successful athletes. It's also about, doing good in other areas. So, yeah. I mean, I totally agree with that, and would love to see that collaborations come through.
So I have a couple of final questions that I like to ask my guests on this podcast. Many of you do have a focus on performance and well-being, and you live very busy lives. I see you wearing your ring at the moment, and I'm conscious the last time you had been across several time zones. So I suspect that sleep is one of the things you struggle to get enough of. But I wonder, do you have a working definition of health and well-being for yourself?
I live a very, very weird life. I'm living in California. I've got a bunch of colleagues in Europe, Israel, and Milan and London. I've got 2 kids who I really enjoy putting to bed. And also, for the first time, the last few years, for the first time in a very, very long time, I actually don't live in a big city. So the stimulation of staying up very late and doing stuff has gone away. So for me, it's the 3 basic things. It's getting the sleep I need, which is for me a minimum of 6, but better off 8. It is cleaning up the nutrition, which in my case is heavily sensitive to emotional roller coasters, and it's getting the exercise. And I know, I don't need to read. Well, I want to say this humbly. I know when I'm hitting the sweet spots on all 3, and I know when I'm not. So I could go for a run, or I could go for some kind of workout, but I know when I'm there. I know when I'm not. For me, it's a challenge. It's a self-discipline challenge. The one thing that I feel really makes the biggest difference for me is nutrition. Yeah. And I've done different things. I've done a little bit of vegan. I've done keto for a few periods of time in my life. I felt phenomenal. It is for me the most disciplined. Like it is the most rewarding piece of the puzzle. If you conquer that, then everything else for me works much, much better. The good thing about the ring is that we all know that not sleeping great for a couple of days is mentally devastating, but the ring will tell you that it with numbers. There's no longer, any doubt about, I could go for one more day of just sleeping 3 hours. So that's what I like about the ring.
So for people that don't have a visual, can you just explain? You're wearing... Yeah.
I'm wearing a product called Aura, O-U-R-A. I've been using it for about 2 years. I absolutely love it. It will quantify. There's a little camera inside the ring taking pictures of your skin, and it will tell you things like body temperature variations, heart rate at rest, HRV, which is a good number, indirectly indicating fatigue and stress, activity levels, like if you're running around or walking. And they have a very, very visible, pleasing, and not intrusive way of visualizing useful information for you.
And do you use, so at times when you're particularly busy, challenged, stressed, do you have any go-to techniques, any rituals for yourself, maybe mantras, or do you use your data?
Interestingly, a big part of my life was spent doing martial arts and partly yoga. Um, Over time, right now, so for a long time, those were my go-tos. Um, right now, I'm doing something that I call Aikido snacks with my kids. We do a 10-minute thing on the
That's
rug
great.
at home of moving around with the 5-year-old and 7-year-old. That's great. Um, I will go to physical activities for recalibration. So I'll
Yeah.
do, I don't know, 20, 50 push-ups. I'll do some pull-ups. I'll just get the body moving in a way. And I'm also right now looking at doing things like cold showers. I've discovered cold showers
Yeah.
is a pretty cool trick. So I'm trying that as well now. I do feel like I need to rebalance some of that with more mental, spiritual snacks. But right now, that's what I can kind of fit into the lifestyle.
No, perfect. And you said we were just talked a little bit about reading. So we do have a kind of blossoming podcast, book list for the podcast. Is there anything that you have recently read or anything you would recommend to readers? It might be something around the subject we've discussed today or something else that you have really been stimulated by recently.
I'll take a kind of pass. I would say you should all read. I would recommend watching the Social Dilemma film on
Yeah.
Netflix.
Yeah. Yeah. I watched that. Yeah.
That
I
has
agree.
dramatically changed a lot of decisions I've made about myself and my kids. Um, that would be my recommendation.
Perfect.
Oh, and look at your iPhone weekly screen time summaries every week. Those numbers are absolutely devastating if you dive into them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, maybe that would be something that you would think about incorporating into the Zone 7 data bank in the future. Thank you very much for your time, Tal. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And I'm really excited to see where your work and this technology might go in the future, particularly in my work environment. I'll put a link to your website and your LinkedIn account and the other social media handles that you mentioned. Encourage people to reach out and also to read some of the excellent blogs that you've written that really break this down in, I think, a very accessible format for people like myself. And yeah, I'd love to hear from anyone listening, your thoughts and any commentary on this conversation. Thank you very much for listening.
So that's part of the challenges of my role. It's not just about creating technology, Silicon Valley style, that is cool and fast and all that. It's also about, I want to say winning the hearts and minds, but it's also about, creating science-driven proof that this has merit. And so a big part of that is not overstepping your boundaries and not stepping on landmines and holding back if you're not 100% confident in the results you're showing. And that's what we do. That's what we do.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are at this very minute experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.